Have you ever wondered how a single $10 decision could completely change someone's life? Imagine being 6 months pregnant, abandoned by the person you trusted most, homeless, with only $37 left in your pocket. Most people would believe the story ends there. But what if that desperate woman spent her last $10 on an abandoned fire station and discovered something hidden inside that would not only save her life, but transform an entire community for generations? This isn't just another inspirational story about overcoming hardship. It's a powerful, true-to-life reminder that hope can be found in the most unexpected places, and that one small act of kindness can create a legacy far greater than wealth. Stay with us until the very end, because the incredible discovery waiting behind the walls of that forgotten fire station, and the emotional decision Sarah makes afterward, has brought millions of people to tears, and may completely change the way you see your own struggles. Sometimes, the worst day of your life is only the beginning of your greatest miracle. At 30 years old, Sarah Mitchell believed she was entering the most beautiful chapter of her life. She was 6 months pregnant, and every tiny movement from the baby growing inside her reminded her that, despite all the uncertainty in the world, she was about to become someone's mother. She imagined lullabies. She imagined tiny fingers wrapping around hers. She imagined the day she would finally hear her baby call her Mom. But life has a cruel way of destroying dreams without warning. On a cold Thursday afternoon, Sarah stood outside the apartment she had called home for nearly 5 years. One hand rested protectively over her swollen belly. The other gripped a faded duffel bag containing everything she still owned. Behind the closed front door stood the man who had once promised to spend forever with her. Her husband, the father of the baby she carried. Just minutes earlier, he had looked into her tear-filled eyes and spoken words she would never forget. "I can't do this anymore." There was no argument left. No apology. No explanation. Only the sound of the door locking behind her. That single click shattered everything she believed about love. Sarah remained frozen on the sidewalk for several seconds, unable to convince herself that it was real. She had no parents left to call. No siblings waiting to rescue her. No close friends with a spare room. She was 30 years old, 6 months pregnant, and suddenly homeless. A gentle kick came from inside her belly. Sarah instinctively placed both hands over her stomach. "It's okay," she whispered through trembling lips, though she didn't believe her own words. "Mommy will figure something out." She wasn't trying to comfort herself anymore. She was trying to comfort the tiny life depending entirely on her. That realization hurt more than anything else. The first night she spent in a cheap roadside motel, paying with almost everything left in her wallet. When morning arrived, so did reality. After checking out, she counted her money. $37? That was all. $37 to feed herself. $37 to feed the baby. $37 to somehow survive until tomorrow. She spent the entire day searching for help. Every homeless shelter nearby was full. Churches offered meals, but no beds. The waiting list for emergency housing stretched for months. She called every number she could think of. Some never answered. Some politely apologized. Others simply told her there was nothing they could do. By sunset, Sarah understood something terrifying. The world could continue turning, even while a pregnant woman had nowhere safe to sleep. That evening, she found herself sitting alone beneath the awning of a closed convenience store. The concrete beneath her was cold. Cars drove past without slowing down. People hurried home to warm dinners and comfortable beds. Nobody noticed the exhausted woman hugging her pregnant belly in the darkness. Nobody asked if she was all right. Nobody knew she hadn't eaten since breakfast because she wanted to save every dollar for the days ahead. The baby moved again. Sarah smiled through tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm trying." The following days blurred together. She learned which public parks had drinking fountains. She learned which gas stations allowed customers to use the restroom without asking questions. She learned how to make one loaf of bread last several days. She learned that loneliness becomes much heavier when you're carrying another heartbeat inside you. Every night she fell asleep wondering the same question. What kind of mother lets her baby enter the world with nowhere to call home? The question haunted her. Not because she lacked love, because love alone couldn't provide a roof, or food, or safety. Then, on the 5th day of wandering through a town she had never intended to visit, Sarah noticed an old bulletin board outside the county courthouse. Most of the papers advertised yard sales, missing pets, or community events. She almost kept walking, until one faded notice caught her attention. County tax auction. Curious, she stepped closer. Most of the listed properties required hundreds or even thousands of dollars, far beyond anything she could ever afford. Then her eyes stopped on the final listing. Former fire station. Minimum bid $10. $10! She stared at the paper for a long time. $10 represented nearly 1/3 of everything she had left. Buying an abandoned building made absolutely no sense. She needed food, medical care, a safe place to sleep, not a ruined fire station. Yet something inside her refused to walk away. It wasn't logic. It wasn't hope. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, as though invisible hands were quietly guiding her toward a place she had never seen. A place that had somehow been waiting for her long before she ever arrived. Sarah took one final look at the notice before slowly folding it into her pocket. She had no idea that this single decision, this impossible gamble made with her last few dollars, would uncover a secret hidden for decades, a secret powerful enough to change not only her life, but the future of the child she hadn't even met yet. And if Sarah walked away now, she would never discover why fate had led a broken, abandoned mother to an abandoned fire station. The county tax auction began at exactly 10 o'clock on a gray Saturday morning. A cold breeze swept across the courthouse lawn as folding chairs slowly filled with local investors, contractors, and landowners who greeted each other like old friends. They laughed, exchanged handshakes, and casually discussed which abandoned properties were worth buying this year. Sarah Mitchell stood alone near the back. Her oversized jacket barely hid the curve of her 6-month pregnant belly. She clutched her worn purse with both hands, silently counting the money inside for what felt like the 100th time. $37. That was every dollar she had left. If she spent $10 today, she would have only $27 to survive on. $27 to feed herself. $27 to feed the little life growing inside her. Every logical thought screamed at her to walk away, but something wouldn't let her leave. One by one, the properties were auctioned. A vacant lot sold for $800. A rundown farmhouse brought in nearly $2,000. An abandoned warehouse sold before Sarah even understood what was happening. Each bid reminded her that she didn't belong here. She wasn't an investor. She wasn't looking for profit. She was simply a frightened mother searching for somewhere, anywhere that might keep her baby safe. Nearly an hour later, the clerk adjusted his glasses and looked down at the final page. Property number 12, he announced. Former fire station on Briggs Road. He paused before continuing. Minimum opening bid, $10. Silence. No one moved. A few people exchanged amused smiles. Someone quietly chuckled. Another man shook his head. That old place should have been demolished years ago, someone whispered. The roof leaks. The plumbing's gone. Nothing but a pile of bricks. The clerk waited several more seconds. Do I have $10? Sarah's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her fingers tightened around the paddle resting on her lap. This was insane. She needed groceries, prenatal vitamins, a doctor's appointment, not an abandoned fire station. Her baby kicked gently, almost as if reminding her, Keep going. Before she had time to change her mind, Sarah slowly raised her hand. I'll bid $10. The entire crowd turned toward her. Conversation stopped instantly. Several people stared in disbelief. A pregnant woman, buying a condemned fire station. One older gentleman removed his glasses, convinced he had heard incorrectly. The clerk blinked. $10 from the young lady. He looked around the audience. Do I hear 15? Nothing. Not a single paddle moved. The silence stretched across the lawn. Going once? Sarah's pulse raced. Part of her prayed someone else would bid. Part of her desperately hoped no one would. Going twice? Still. Nothing. The clerk finally lowered his gavel. Sold? The sharp crack echoed through the courthouse grounds. Just like that, Sarah Mitchell became the owner of an abandoned fire station. She wasn't sure whether she had just saved her future or destroyed it completely. Inside the courthouse office, the paperwork took only a few minutes. The county clerk accepted Sarah's wrinkled $10 bill before sliding a weathered brass key across the counter. As Sarah picked it up, the woman studying her couldn't hide the concern in her eyes. Are you sure you know what you're buying? Sarah looked down at the old key resting in her palm. No, she answered honestly. The clerk gave a sad smile. I don't think anyone ever really did. Outside, Sarah followed the directions written on the deed. The fire station sat only a few blocks from Main Street. As she approached, the building slowly emerged behind overgrown weeds and cracked pavement. Time had not been kind to it. Its red brick walls were stained by years of rain. The garage doors hung crooked, rust covering every hinge. Broken windows stared back at her like empty eyes. Nature had begun reclaiming everything people had abandoned. Most would have seen nothing more than a forgotten ruin. Sarah saw something different. Walls, a roof, shelter, for the first time in nearly a week. A place where she might sleep without wondering who would wake her in the middle of the night and tell her to leave. She slipped the old key into the lock. It resisted at first, then out with a rough metallic groan. The heavy door slowly opened. Dust floated through beams of sunlight, pouring into the dark interior. The air smelled of old wood, rust, and memories that had been trapped for years. Sarah stepped carefully inside. Every footstep echoed through the massive, empty garage. Pieces of broken ceiling covered the concrete floor. Rainwater had left dark stains across the walls. Old lockers lined the back hallway. Everything appeared forgotten. Everything! Except one strange detail. At the very rear of the building, behind a row of heavy steel lockers, Sarah noticed a section of wall that looked different from the rest. The bricks didn't match. The mortar was newer, as if someone had deliberately sealed something away. She slowly walked toward it. Without knowing why, her heartbeat quickened. Something was hidden behind that wall. She could feel it. And although Sarah had arrived believing she had purchased nothing more than an abandoned building, she was only moments away from uncovering a secret that had been waiting decades for someone exactly like her to find it. Sarah stood silently in front of the strange wall at the back of the fire station. The rest of the building had been constructed with old red brick, weathered by decades of wind and rain. But this section, it was different. The concrete blocks were newer. The mortar lines didn't match. Someone had built this wall long after the station was finished. And for one simple reason, to hide something. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She rested one hand on her belly while reaching out with the other. Her fingertips brushed against the cold concrete. She knocked softly. Solid! She knocked again, this time farther to the left. The sound changed. Hollow. Sarah froze. She knocked once more. There it was again. A hollow echo. Her pulse quickened. Whatever was behind this wall, it wasn't empty. She knelt slowly, despite the weight of her pregnancy, carefully lowering herself onto one knee. Near the floor, beneath the row of rusted steel lockers, she noticed a narrow opening no wider than her little finger. A faint stream of cool air drifted through the crack. Fresh air. That meant only one thing. There was a room behind the wall. A room that had somehow remained sealed for years. Sarah grabbed the nearest locker and pulled with all her strength. Nothing. The locker didn't move an inch. She tried again, bracing one foot against the wall. Still nothing. The lockers had been bolted directly into the concrete floor. Whoever hid this room had made absolutely certain no one would ever find it. She leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. The baby shifted inside her. "I'm okay," she whispered. "I'm just thinking." Her eyes wandered toward the broken front windows. Across the street stood a small hardware store with a faded wooden sign. It was her only chance. A few minutes later, the bell above the store door rang softly as Sarah stepped inside. The shop smelled of fresh-cut lumber, machine oil, and old pine shelves that had absorbed decades of sawdust. Behind the counter stood an older man with silver hair and kind eyes. He looked up immediately. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. Instead, his attention drifted to Sarah's swollen belly, then to the exhaustion written across her face. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked gently. Sarah forced a tired smile. "I hope so. I need a socket wrench, maybe a pry bar. What are you working on?" She hesitated before answering. "The old fire station." The man's eyebrows lifted. "You're the woman who bought it this morning." Sarah nodded. "I know it sounds crazy." "No," the man replied quietly. "It sounds like someone was desperate enough to believe in a place everyone else gave up on." Those words struck something deep inside her. He walked her toward a shelf filled with tools and handed her a heavy socket set. "This should do it." Sarah turned over the price tag. $22. Her heart sank. She couldn't afford it. She looked down, embarrassed. "I only have $27 left. If I buy these, I won't have enough money for food." The older man studied her face for a long moment. Then he slowly closed the toolbox. "Take it." Sarah looked up. "What?" "Bring it back when you're finished. I'll pay you." "I know you will." Before she could answer, he disappeared into a back room. Moments later, he returned, carrying a small paper bag and a cup of hot coffee. "My wife packs an extra lunch every morning," he said. "I think today it belongs to you." Sarah stared at the sandwich. She hadn't eaten since early that morning. The smell alone nearly brought tears to her eyes. I can't." "Yes, you can." He smiled warmly. "And your little one probably shouldn't skip lunch." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. No one had asked how she was doing. No one had offered help. Not until now. She accepted the bag with trembling hands. "Thank you." The man extended his hand. "My name's Ray Thompson. Sarah, it's nice to meet you." "No," Ray said with a gentle smile. "I have a feeling this town's been waiting to meet you." An hour later, after finishing every last bite of the sandwich, Sarah returned to the station. Armed with the borrowed tools, she began removing the rusted bolts one by one. Each bolt fought back. Each locker seemed heavier than the last. Her arms ached. Her back burned. Several times she stopped simply to catch her breath. But she refused to quit. One locker, then another, then another. The loud screech of steel scraping across concrete echoed through the empty building. Sweat dripped from her forehead despite the cool afternoon air. Nearly 2 hours later, the final locker slid away. Sarah stood frozen. Hidden behind the row of lockers, exactly as she had suspected, was a heavy steel door painted faded red. The words on its surface were barely visible beneath layers of dust and rust. Chief's office. She slowly reached for the handle. Locked. Her heart pounded. She wedged the pry bar into the frame and leaned forward with every ounce of strength she had left. Once. Nothing. Twice. The metal groaned. On the third attempt. Crack. The ancient lock finally snapped. The heavy door slowly swung inward. A wave of cool air rolled out from the darkness. Unlike the rest of the station, this room had remained perfectly preserved. A wooden desk stood exactly where someone had left it years ago. Filing cabinets lined the walls. Framed photographs covered every inch of space. Dust rested undisturbed across every surface. It looked less like an abandoned office, and more like someone had walked out yesterday, fully expecting to come back. Sarah stepped inside. She had entered the building searching for nothing more than shelter. Instead, she had just opened the first door to a mystery that someone had spent decades protecting. And on the desk, waiting beneath a layer of dust, lay an old leather journal. It seemed as though it had been waiting for only one person to read it. Sarah stood quietly in the hidden office, afraid that even the sound of her breathing might disturb the silence that had lived there for years. Unlike the rest of the fire station, this room had escaped time. The desk was neatly organized. Old filing cabinets stood against the walls. Photographs of firefighters, community events, and rescue crews hung in perfectly straight rows, each frame protected beneath a thin layer of dust. Nothing had been vandalized. Nothing had been stolen. It felt less like an abandoned office, and more like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Her eyes settled on the leather journal lying in the center of the desk. Its cover was worn smooth by years of careful hands. She gently opened it. The first pages contained ordinary records: training schedules, equipment inspections, maintenance reports. Everything looked exactly as she expected from an old fire station. But several pages later, the handwriting changed. The entries became personal. The fire chief had begun writing about people instead of buildings. Mrs. Dawson lost her husband today, paid her heating bill anonymously, covered surgery expenses for the Miller family. They must never know who helped. Repaired the Johnsons' roof before winter arrived. Sarah turned another page. Then another. The pattern continued. For decades, someone had quietly helped families through their darkest moments. Medical bills, funeral costs, emergency rent, school tuition, food for children. Every act of kindness was carefully recorded. Every dollar accounted for. Yet nowhere in the journal did the writer seek recognition. There were no speeches, no praise, no newspaper articles. Only one simple sentence appeared again and again. People accept help more easily when they don't feel they owe someone. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. She had spent the past week believing the world had become cold, believing people only looked after themselves, believing kindness had disappeared. Yet here, hidden behind a sealed wall, was proof that goodness had quietly existed all along. She continued reading. The journal entries grew more emotional as the years passed. One name appeared repeatedly: Chief Daniel Carter, the man who had written every page. Then another name began appearing beside his: Emily Harper. Sarah assumed she was another firefighter, until she found an entry dated nearly 18 years earlier. Emily died today, saving 11 children trapped inside Riverside Elementary. Sarah stopped reading. Her chest tightened. She looked toward the photographs covering the wall. One picture immediately caught her attention. A young woman wearing firefighter gear stood beside a smiling man outside the station. They couldn't have been older than 30. On the back of the frame, someone had written, "Daniel and Emily always the first to run toward danger." Sarah swallowed hard. She turned back to the journal. The next several pages described the school fire in heartbreaking detail. Smoke, Collapsed hallways. Children trapped upstairs. Volunteers refusing to leave until every child escaped. Emily had carried child after child through broken windows before the ceiling collapsed around her. She never came back out. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes. Without thinking, she rested both hands over her belly. For the first time since her husband abandoned her, she wasn't thinking about betrayal. She wasn't thinking about being homeless. She wasn't even thinking about tomorrow. She was thinking about mothers, about what a mother would sacrifice to save a child she had never even met. The room suddenly felt different, warmer, as though the people whose photographs lined these walls were still quietly watching over the place they had loved. Then something slipped from between the pages of the journal. A folded envelope, yellow with age. Across the front, written in neat blue ink, were only 6 words. "For the one who finds this..." Sarah's heartbeat quickened. She carefully unfolded the letter. Inside was a handwritten message. "If you're reading this, it means the station has chosen you." She frowned. Chosen. The letter continued. "This building was never meant to become another forgotten ruin. It was built to protect lives. Even after the fire engine stopped running, I prayed it would continue protecting someone who needed it most." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She looked around the empty office. The broken station had protected her. For the first time in days, she had slept beneath a roof. For the first time in nearly a week. She had felt safe. The words on the page blurred as tears rolled down her cheeks. "If life has brought you here," the letter read, "then perhaps you've already lost more than anyone should have to lose. But please remember this. The worst day of your life doesn't have to become the last chapter of your story." Sarah couldn't hold back anymore. She cried quietly, one hand clutching the letter while the other rested protectively over her unborn child. Only a few days earlier, she had believed she was completely alone. Now she realized something extraordinary. Long before she ever stepped inside this forgotten fire station, someone she had never met had prepared this place. Not simply to preserve memories, but to restore hope. And for the first time since the door of her old life had closed behind her, Sarah allowed herself to believe that perhaps losing everything was not the end of her story. Perhaps it was the beginning of the life she and her baby had been meant to find all along. Sarah remained seated at the old wooden desk long after the tears had stopped falling. The letter rested gently between her trembling fingers as golden rays of late afternoon sunlight streamed through the dusty windows. For the first time in days, the silence around her no longer felt lonely. Instead, it felt comforting, as though the old fire station itself had been waiting for someone to return. Only a week earlier, Sarah had believed the world had completely forgotten her. Now, a man she had never met had somehow reached across decades to remind her that hope could survive long after the people who created it were gone. Carefully folding the letter, she slipped it back inside the journal. As she did, something metallic caught her eye. A small brass key had been taped beneath the journal's back cover. Attached to it was a handwritten note. "The safe beneath the desk." Her heartbeat quickened. Slowly lowering herself onto one knee, Sarah reached beneath the heavy oak desk. Her fingertips brushed against cold steel hidden underneath the wood. A fireproof safe? It had been concealed so perfectly that no one would have noticed it without knowing exactly where to look. With trembling hands, she inserted the brass key. For several long seconds, she simply stared at the lock. Whatever was inside had remained untouched for years. Taking a deep breath, she turned the key. Click! The heavy door slowly swung open. Inside rested 3 carefully preserved items: a thick leather folder, a sealed envelope, and a small wooden box wrapped with a faded blue ribbon. Sarah reached for the leather folder first. Inside were property deeds, maintenance records, insurance papers, and legal documents dating back decades. As she carefully turned each page, one title immediately captured her attention: the Fire Station Preservation Trust. She read every line slowly. Years before the station had been scheduled for demolition, Fire Chief Daniel Carter had purchased the property with his own retirement savings. Rather than allowing it to become another commercial building, he had established a charitable trust to protect it forever. The trust included one condition that immediately brought tears to Sarah's eyes. The station could never be sold for profit. Instead, it would always remain a refuge for people with nowhere else to go. Near the bottom of the final page, Chief Carter had written one last message in blue ink. "If someone ever needs these walls more than I do, let this place become their shelter until life gives them another chance." Sarah closed her eyes. Only days earlier, those words described her perfectly. She had been frightened, homeless, pregnant, completely alone. And somehow, this building had already begun keeping its promise. With shaking hands, she reached for the sealed envelope. Inside were bank statements, investment reports, and trust documents. The first page displayed a balance that made her stop breathing for a moment. Community Hope Trust. Available balance 3/18 or no 746.82. She stared at the number again. Then again. Surely she had misunderstood. More than $300,000 remained in the account. The accompanying documents explained everything. For over 30 years, firefighters, local business owners, churches, teachers, and anonymous families had quietly contributed to the trust. The money had been used whenever someone in the community faced impossible circumstances, medical emergencies, devastating house fires, funeral expenses, or families who simply needed one more chance to rebuild their lives. Whatever remained had been carefully invested, allowing the fund to continue growing long after the station had closed. Clipped to the final page was one simple instruction: the trustee shall use these funds only to continue helping those who have nowhere else to turn. Sarah slowly lowered the papers. Just 1 week ago, home, she had been exactly that person. Someone with nowhere to sleep. Someone praying that one stranger might care enough to help. The discovery wasn't simply about money. It was proof that compassion could outlive the people who first created it. She wiped away another tear before opening the final item. The small wooden box? Its faded ribbon came loose with a gentle tug. Inside were dozens of handwritten note cards, each carefully preserved despite the passing years. Every card contained only a first name and a few heartfelt sentences. "Thank you for paying my mother's surgery. Because of this place, my children still have a home. I never learned your name, but you saved our family. Your kindness inspired me to help others." Some notes had been written by adults. Others came from children using colorful crayons. Several still carried faint tear stains. Sarah read every single one. Each card represented a life that had been changed forever. Each message proved that even the smallest act of kindness could echo through generations. By the time she finished reading the final card, she realized she was no longer standing inside an abandoned fire station. She was standing inside a legacy, a place built not with bricks and steel, but with compassion. The baby suddenly kicked. Sarah instinctively smiled and rested both hands on her belly. "You felt that too, didn't you?" she whispered softly. "I think this place has been waiting for us." For the first time since her husband had walked away, she believed those words. Not because she had discovered money, not because she finally had a roof over her head, but because she had discovered a purpose greater than her own pain. Perhaps she hadn't been led here merely to survive. Perhaps she had been brought here to continue the work that Chief Carter had begun decades earlier. She slowly walked into the massive truck bay once again. The cracked walls, the broken windows, the peeling paint. Only yesterday they had looked like signs of failure. Today they looked like possibilities. She imagined families finding temporary shelter inside these walls. Single mothers receiving help without shame. Children laughing where silence had ruled for years. Neighbors gathering once again in a place built to protect lives. She gently placed one hand over her heart and the other over her unborn child. Then, looking around the empty station, she whispered a promise. "I'll take care of this place. Or just as it took care of us." Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the old brass bell hanging above the entrance. Its soft chime echoed through the quiet street. For just a moment. It almost sounded as though the fire station itself had been waiting decades to hear those words. The transformation didn't happen overnight. The old fire station still leaked whenever it rained. The walls still needed paint. The floors still creaked beneath every step. And every morning, Sarah woke with aching muscles, swollen feet, and the constant reminder that her baby would arrive in just a few months. But something inside her had changed. Only a week earlier, she had measured every day by what she had lost. Now, she measured every day by what she could build. Each sunrise brought new volunteers. Ray arrived first every morning, carrying a thermos of fresh coffee and a toolbox that looked older than the fire station itself. "Morning, boss," he would joke. Sarah laughed every time. "I'm definitely not the boss." Ray grinned. "Funny, because everyone else seems to think you are." Soon afterward, Martha would appear with homemade breakfast. Sometimes pancakes, sometimes biscuits, sometimes warm cinnamon rolls that filled the station with a comforting smell Sarah hadn't experienced in years. The retired electrician rewired the building room by room. The plumber replaced every broken pipe. High school students spent their weekends scraping paint, mowing the overgrown lawn, and cleaning decades of dust from every corner. No one asked for payment. No one expected recognition. They simply showed up. Watching them work reminded Sarah of the notes she had discovered inside the wooden box. Kindness had become contagious. One generous act inspired another, then another, until an entire community found itself working towards the same purpose. One afternoon, while sorting through old storage cabinets, Sarah discovered dozens of unused firefighter lockers. Instead of throwing them away, she had an idea. "What if," she said to Ray, "we turned these into storage spaces for families who have nowhere else to keep their belongings?" Ray smiled immediately. "I think Chief Carter would have loved that." The next day, they painted every locker bright red. Children from the neighborhood decorated each door with hand-painted flowers, stars, and encouraging messages. One little girl carefully wrote, "Everyone deserves a fresh start." Sarah stood quietly reading those words. She realized they weren't just meant for strangers. They were meant for her, too. As the weeks passed, the station slowly transformed into something beautiful. One room became a temporary shelter for mothers escaping difficult situations. Another became a children's playroom filled with donated books and toys. The old firefighter's kitchen was completely renovated into a community dining room where anyone could share a warm meal without questions or judgment. Even the truck bay, once filled with broken equipment and rust, became a gathering space for local events, free medical clinics, and parenting classes. Every improvement carried the fingerprints of someone who simply wanted to help. Then, one crisp autumn morning, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A young woman stood nervously outside the entrance, holding the hand of a little boy no older than 5. Her clothes were worn. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. She looked exactly the way Sarah had looked only weeks earlier. I heard this place helps people." Sarah smiled gently. "It does." The young woman hesitated. "I left my husband yesterday. He wasn't a good man. I don't know where else to go." Sarah looked into the frightened mother's eyes. For a brief moment, it felt like she was staring at her own reflection. Without saying another word, Sarah stepped forward and wrapped her in a gentle embrace. "You don't have to explain. You're safe now." The woman burst into tears. Her little boy clung tightly to Sarah's leg. Instinctively, Sarah knelt despite her growing pregnancy and smiled at him. "Are you hungry?" He nodded shyly. Minutes later, Martha was serving them hot soup. Children invited the little boy to play. Volunteers prepared one of the shelter rooms upstairs. No paperwork, no interrogation, no judgment, only kindness. As Sarah watched the frightened family settle into safety, she finally understood why life had brought her here. She hadn't been rescued simply so she could survive. She had been rescued so she could become someone else's rescue. That realization changed everything. Weeks turned into months. The fire station developed a new reputation throughout the county. People no longer called it the abandoned station on Briggs Road. They called it Hope House, a place where no one was turned away. Local doctors volunteered prenatal care. Retired teachers offered free tutoring. Counselors donated their evenings to support families rebuilding their lives. Churches, businesses, and schools began organizing monthly donation drives. The trust fund continued helping those facing emergencies, exactly as Chief Carter had intended. But Sarah insisted on one rule. No one receiving help would ever feel like a charity case. Every guest would be treated with dignity. Every child would feel welcome. Every parent would leave believing tomorrow could be better than today. One evening, after the volunteers had gone home, Sarah stood alone outside the station. The setting sun painted the restored brick walls with shades of orange and gold. The old brass bell above the entrance gleamed for the first time in decades. She gently rested both hands on her belly. The baby kicked. A strong kick this time. Sarah smiled. "I know," she whispered. "You like it here too." She looked up at the freshly painted sign above the entrance. Hope House. The words filled her heart with gratitude. Not long ago, she had stood on another doorstep, abandoned by the man she trusted most. She believed her story had ended that day. Now she understood something entirely different. Sometimes life closes one door. Not to punish us, but to lead us toward another door we never would have found on our own. Standing beneath the evening sky, surrounded by the sounds of laughter drifting through the open windows, Sarah realized she was no longer defined by betrayal. She was no longer the woman who had been abandoned. She was a mother, a protector, a leader, and without realizing it, she had become exactly what Chief Daniel Carter had hoped someone would one day become. The heartbeat of a place where broken lives could begin again. Winter arrived just a few weeks before Sarah's due date. Snow covered the roof of Hope House, softening the edges of the once abandoned fire station. Warm lights glowed from every window, and for the first time in decades, laughter echoed through the halls every single day. Families gathered around the long dining tables each evening. Children ran through the playroom with carefree smiles. Volunteers came and went carrying groceries, blankets, and homemade meals. The building that everyone had once called a forgotten ruin had become the heart of the entire community. And at the center of it all was the woman who had arrived with nothing more than $37 and a broken heart. One snowy evening, Sarah was helping Martha prepare dinner when she suddenly stopped. A sharp pain spread across her lower back. She grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter. Martha looked up immediately. "Sarah." Another contraction hit. "Stronger this time." Sarah forced a nervous smile. "I think it's time." Within seconds, Hope House burst into action. Ray rushed to start his truck. Pastor Lewis grabbed Sarah's hospital bag, which had been packed weeks earlier. The retired nurse who volunteered every Wednesday calmly checked Sarah's breathing. Someone called the hospital. Another volunteer stayed behind to comfort the frightened children who had gathered in the hallway. No one panicked. Everyone simply knew what needed to be done. As Ray carefully helped Sarah into the truck, she looked back at the building. Only months earlier, she had stood outside those same doors wondering if she would survive another night. Now, dozens of people stood beneath the porch lights, waving, praying, and cheering her on. She wasn't leaving alone. She was carrying an entire community with her. Several hours later, just before sunrise, a tiny cry filled the delivery room. Sarah burst into tears. "So beautiful," she whispered. The nurse gently placed the baby into her arms. "It's a little girl." For several moments, Sarah couldn't speak. She simply stared into the tiny face resting against her chest. 10 perfect fingers, 10 tiny toes, bright, curious eyes that had not yet seen the world. The same world Sarah had once feared would never be kind to her child. But now she knew differently. She kissed her daughter's forehead. "You'll never grow up believing you're alone. You already have a family." When Ray, Martha, and Pastor Lewis quietly entered the room later that morning, each of them carried flowers. Ray cleared his throat, trying unsuccessfully to hide his emotions. "So, have you picked a name?" Sarah smiled. She looked down at the sleeping baby, then back at the people who had become her family. I'm naming her." "Hope?" Silence filled the room. Then Martha wiped away tears. "It's perfect," because she wasn't named after a person. She was named after the gift that had saved both their lives. 3 months later, the town held a celebration unlike anything anyone could remember. Colorful banners stretched across Main Street. Children painted murals along the sidewalks. Local musicians played on a small outdoor stage. Hundreds of residents gathered outside Hope House for its official reopening ceremony. The mayor stepped to the podium. He smiled toward the restored fire station standing proudly behind him. "There was a time," he began, "when this building represented everything we had forgotten." He paused. "Today, it represents everything we can become." The crowd applauded. Then he invited Sarah to speak. She slowly walked onto the stage with little Hope resting peacefully in her arms. For a moment, she simply looked at the crowd. She recognized nearly every face. The electrician, the plumber, the teenagers who painted walls after school, the elderly women who knitted baby blankets, the doctors, the teachers, the volunteers, the families who had once needed help, and now returned every weekend to help someone else. Sarah smiled through tears. "I used to believe strength meant surviving on your own." She glanced down at her daughter. "But this little girl taught me something different before she was even born." She looked back at the crowd. "Real strength is allowing people to love you when you feel unworthy of love. And real healing begins the moment we decide to become the answer to someone else's prayer." The crowd stood in silence. Many quietly wiped away tears. Sarah continued, "The day I bought this building, I thought I was saving an abandoned fire station." She smiled. "I was wrong." She looked around at everyone gathered before her. "This place saved me!" Thunderous applause echoed across the square. But Sarah wasn't finished. She reached into her pocket and removed Chief Daniel Carter's weathered letter. "I never had the chance to thank the man who believed this building could keep changing lives long after he was gone." She carefully folded the letter again. "So today, I'll honor him the only way I know how." She turned toward the entrance of Hope House. Above the restored doorway hung a brand new bronze plaque. Its inscription read, "This house belongs to every person who believes that kindness can change a life. No one who enters these doors will ever be treated as a stranger." The crowd rose to its feet. Many applauded. Others simply cried. As the ceremony ended, children released dozens of white balloons into the bright blue sky. Sarah held baby Hope close while watching them drift higher and higher. Months earlier, She had believed her life had ended the day her husband closed the apartment door behind her. Now she understood something extraordinary. Sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as unbearable heartbreak. If she had never been abandoned, she never would have found Hope House. She never would have met the people who became her family. She never would have discovered the legacy of Chief Daniel Carter. And she never would have realized that the strongest homes are not built with bricks or wood. They are built with compassion. As the afternoon sun bathed Hope House in warm golden light, Sarah smiled at the joyful sound of children laughing inside the building. She looked down at her daughter and whispered the words she had once struggled to believe herself. "We're home. And this time," she knew they always would be. Every life reaches a moment when everything seems to fall apart. Sometimes it's the loss of someone we love. Sometimes it's losing a home, a career, or the future we believed was certain. In those painful moments, it's easy to believe that life has turned against us. Sarah believed that too. When her husband abandoned her, 6 months pregnant and with almost nothing to her name, she thought her story was over. She believed she had become invisible. But life had something greater waiting just beyond her deepest heartbreak. The abandoned fire station wasn't simply an old building. It was a reminder that hope often appears in the places everyone else has given up on. Just like people, we often judge ourselves by our worst day, our biggest mistake, our greatest loss. But those moments never define who we are. They only prepare us for who we can become. Chief Daniel Carter understood something that many people spend an entire lifetime trying to learn. True wealth isn't measured by the money we leave behind. It's measured by the lives we change. Years after he was gone, his kindness continued rescuing families he would never meet. His compassion became a legacy, and Sarah chose to continue that legacy, because one act of kindness always has the power to inspire another, and another, until an entire community begins to change. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all. You may never know how much one encouraging word, one helping hand, or one unexpected act of generosity can mean to someone standing at the edge of giving up. Sometimes, you don't need to save the whole world. You only need to save one person's hope. And that single moment of compassion may change generations. Call to action. If Sarah's journey touched your heart, take a moment to think about someone in your own life who may be silently struggling today. A simple phone call, a kind conversation, or a small act of generosity could become the turning point they desperately need. If this story inspired you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss more heartwarming stories about hope, resilience, and the incredible power of kindness. Finally, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment when one person's kindness completely changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. Your words may become the encouragement someone else needs to keep believing that better days are still ahead.